Hello. So, yeah, today's video is inspired by both just witnessing and feeling the collective energies right now around politics, but also just some inspiring time spent with clients this morning. Um, and I really want to talk about the portal of initiation that is powerlessness. It's really something that is not fun to feel, can be extremely challenging to feel. And, we'll do anything to avoid feeling powerless a lot of the times. Um, I could talk a lot longer and maybe I'll share more in a future video when I'm feeling more like getting into the neuroscience about powerlessness as it's related to freeze and the nervous system, and how to work with freeze. But today, my message is a little bit less technical, feeling more just the inspiration of um, this idea. Some people have heard of the Serenity Prayer about how to, making a prayer to uh, be able to discern what I have control over and what I do not have control over, to have the grace to allow something greater to take charge of what I don't have control over, and the courage to take control over what I do have control over. And at the end, it says, and the discernment to know the difference, right? To know the difference. Now, that ability to be nuanced and know the difference, I think, is really key here, because freeze and powerlessness, it's like a blanket over our minds and bodies. It feels like there's nothing I can do. Like it feels like I can't move. It feels like being crippled. Um, so it's very common from this place when it has grips on you, and I do mean it, like it's a state that has grips on you. You are not this state, even if you feel like it is gripping you. You are not the state. But there's wisdom in the state, as there are in all states when we know how to harvest it. A lot of times there is a need for some respite of some kind of access to ease. It's as if we don't even have the energy to do one more thing in order to get out of the circumstances that are creating the powerlessness. And eventually we will need to take action because we will need to make changes in our lives so that our circumstances aren't keeping us in a place of powerlessness or suffering unnecessarily. However, when we're so burnt out and fatigued, what we really need is the feeling of some greater level of support that has our back so that we can make these changes and not burn out. Um, so usually there's a step that sometimes happens before we can actually take action. And sometimes we are taking action, but it's going in circles or doesn't seem to be actually landing or having any traction. Or sometimes we're overshooting, like we're trying to take big actions, but we can't implement them. So we just keep falling and landing back in the same place. Or sometimes we're trying the same thing over and over, and what we need is to do something a little differently. Oftentimes, what also gets missed is that there's something we need to not be doing that we are doing. There's some place we are lending our energy that we need to reclaim our energy from. And so, especially this last one, I think, is important as a first step before we can even talk about the other kinds of actions to take. Sometimes it's actually the only thing to do. Sometimes we need to take other actions again later, but in order to give ourselves some respite, we need to start here. I really appreciate Carolyn Mace. I study her energy medicine courses, and she uses a phrase that I think is apt, which is about hemorrhaging power or hemorrhaging energy. And she uses the chakra system, which I do follow. I don't think it's necessary for everyone to know that system to understand this concept, though, because it can be hemorrhaging from a particular energy center. It could also be hemorrhaging from a particular channel, our thinking channel, our emotional channel, our image channel, our sensation channel. But essentially, instead of getting too much into the nuances of the ways that our energy can be hemorrhaging, I think it's important to just land this concept that we have agency. This goes back to the serenity prayer. Ultimately, when it comes down to it, something that's really useful and what helped me a lot in my powerlessness, which went on for a very long time and was severe and was physically handicapping as well as mentally, emotionally, and even spiritually. If you strip away, I mean, in each situation, you can kind of pick apart what we have control over and what we don't. But if you take it to the fullest, most existential level, you could say that most things we don't have control over at all. If we're getting really much more existential, um, we will die. Everyone we love will die. We could be exposed to something harmful and get sick or have an injury. We could lose all of our money tomorrow. Even things that have been really reliable for a long time might prove to be unreliable, as we've seen in the last few years and has been seen on the planet in many situations during times of upheaval, like the Great Depression, for example, like potato farming, like whenever there's been a blight or a plague or a war, right? Like, so ultimately, we could say there's a lot of things we don't have control over. But what we can have control over is our attention. And there's a really profound training in attention that can be one of the most grounding and resilient things to cultivate. Um, it's much more powerful than simply, and to use the cliche word, like going Zen, people have this idea this is like blocking out the world and going to a happy place and being distracted. That's not what I mean. It's actually this cultivation of attention in such a way that we are still able, not only are we still able to be in life in an embodied way, we actually are able to do it better because we're living from the inside out instead of the outside in. If anyone's read the book The Master and Its Emissary, it's really putting the right brain more in places steering the ship and the left brain being the servant, or in a more spiritual sense, the soul and the ego. So it's not about one or the other, but it's about the right relationship of mastery and support. So we can actually act in the world and make choices in the world from a place of being empowered. I'm trying to think of maybe an example to share. I mean, there are so many, but I'll just name a fresh and recent one. Was I was driving in the evening just last week and had this really crippling, intense headaches, sort of pressure in my head and fatigue kind of coming on. Um, and instead of kind of just like gritting and bearing and continuing on through the discomfort, or turning around and saying, I have to go home, I can't go to my friend's beautiful ceremony because I'm having this, I just asked for, and it might be different for you. I don't know what your spiritual beliefs are. And I think it can work in any sense, whether it's a religious experience for you, a spiritual one, or simply an energetic one or quantum one. But that way that what we can shift our awareness to not just me, but like me held within this larger reality that does have support, that just needs and is just waiting for me to ask for it or to notice it, right? In the same way that we do in like very simple somatic practices, like right now I'm talking to you, I can feel also the support of this space around me. I can feel the support of the chair holding me. It's a very felt sense thing. But I often extend that into the spiritual realms as well. And so in this case, I made a prayer to my ancestors. I was going to an ancestor ritual, and so I could feel that they were around. And I said, I don't know what this is about, but could you help carry this burden with me so I don't have to carry it alone? This headache, this pressure in my head, this heaviness and this fatigue. And I just let myself speak that out loud. And I noticed after I did that that some emotion began to be like almost like a bubble that was freed from somewhere in my chest and began to move up into my throat. And I felt the tightness that had been in my head, pressurizing my head, sort of like come into this emotion and out through my eyes. And I had a release and I had some tears. I didn't even have any thoughts, honestly. But the movement and the invitation helped something in the alchemy of my body to move. And just that release and the movement of the emotion and the physical salty tears. Um, I mean, you can feel me breathing more deeply now, even as I share the story, but the headache lifted. It went away. That's a tiny little moment, but there are lots of moments like that that we can have in our days. There are many moments like that in the sessions that I give, and I think we often brush over them as insignificant, but we can completely shift a headache that would have had me turn around and go home because it was so uncomfortable in a matter of minutes like that, simply by stopping and asking for a larger sense of support. Now, in order to do that, there really needs to be a feeling of, I have agency in my life. I get to ask for what I need. I get to inhabit my life. I get to be in this space of my body and like I'm worthy and deserving of support and love. Um, that's the only place from which we can ask the questions that will help these greater supports to start coming in, or at least to start landing in. They probably are ready and waiting for us all the time, as I know both from my spiritual experiences and also from my training in neuroscience, which shows this too, which I can talk about more, like I said, in another video. But what I really want to just leave you with today is this knowledge that your agency is its own currency. Your life force, your energy is the greatest currency, more so than money in the bank, possessions, who relationships. Um, and when, and I'm also essentially talking about an existential sense of being okay. of like, what if you stripped everything away that makes you safe, that is outside of yourself, or even inside of yourself physically? Now we're getting into some tricky terrain, but I'm gonna avoid going down that rabbit hole. But if all of that got stripped away, what would you have left? Because that will be the case when you die. And it has been the case for some of us who have gone through a kind of death in life. And there's something that's incredibly empowering about realizing that actually it's okay to let go of so much of that and to recognize that there is something that remains, that is continuous, that is stable, that is trustworthy, that is reliable. And the more that we find ourselves into much tumultuous times where things are not reliable on the outside, the more important it is to hone on what we can rely on. This existential sense of being okay, this life force vitality, this currency that is our own agency. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that for today. If you want any more support, of course, feel free to reach out at enteringstream.com for coaching. And wishing you well in discovering the deep, grounded, and resilient inner peace that comes from living from the inside out and reclaiming your true currency